Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming to tonight's Hackney Society talk by architect Richard Griffiths. I'm Angela Brady and delighted to join tonight. Whilst Richard's talk was recorded at the weekend to reduce the risk of technical glitches, Richard is with us tonight and I'll be chatting to him live at the end of his talk. To ask questions, we will need you to be signed into Google to the YouTube account. You'll be able to view this talk and the questions and answers after tonight's event, but watching live is your opportunity to participate. So please do ask any questions as the chat is going, and then I will put those questions to Richard at the end. So without further ado, let's hear from Richard.
Well, good evening, and it's a great pleasure to be talking to the Hackney Society. I've lived in Hackney since 1986 and have seen a lot of changes. I moved to Hackney in order to work with Julian Harrop, the great practitioner who was particularly associated with saving derelict buildings and buildings which had reached the last stages of dereliction in East London at a time when the battle for conservation, as it were, had just been won, and there were a lot of fascinating buildings in the last stages of dereliction. The project I particularly associated with when I arrived was Sutton House. However, I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to talk about three houses in East London: Clissold House, Newington Green, Unitarian Chapel, and Toynbee Hall. When I came to Hackney, the word for doing up old buildings was probably preservation or repair or conversion. Then there was the word refurbishment. The Americans used the word adaptive reuse. And I have called my talk conservation-led regeneration as being the least, as it were, unsatisfactory of those designations. Conservation is okay because conservation rarely relates to, ultimately, sustainability. Regeneration is about giving new life to rundown areas, and the consequences of regeneration and the change that means in social status is obviously a consequence of that. And again, when I moved to Hackney, on the street corner on a Saturday, there would be the Socialist Revolutionary Party with slogans saying, "Rich scum out of Hackney." And so nevertheless, I have always thought that the reuse of historic buildings for public benefit has been something which can enormously enrich the quality of life. And so I have been fortunate really to work in that field with public buildings on the whole through the whole of my career. Clissold House, wonderful villa of 1780s. Like so many buildings which were in public ownership, particularly those in public parks, the fabric had really run down by the 1970s, 80s, and needed new use. So Clissold was known particularly for the cafe, rather a squalid cafe in many ways, with this flat lawn in front, which was a muddy hole full of pigeons and plastic furniture. However, run by a remarkable lady, Christine, who had a very social vision for the house, which was that everyone should be able to eat there, and you had the squatters from the Crescent next door able to buy instant coffee for, let's say, 40 pence, or you could get a cappuccino for what was then probably £1.50, and all was served. But come years later, with the rest of the house being by that stage derelict, completely derelict and unused, apart from a certain amount of cafe park rangers in the lower ground floor, then it was time for trying to get help from the Heritage Lottery to do more with the house. And I was very conscious of the difficulty of keeping the social purpose, if you like, which was there with Christine, and to juggle the difficult balance between the three things which are set out in the National Planning Policy Framework, which is the primary planning document, which is about a balance between economic factors, social factors, and environmental factors or benefits. So at Clissold, the question was, who was the benefit going to be for? And clearly what happened at the end of the day, which was really a major and enlarged cafe with meeting and function rooms at the first floor level and on part of the ground floor level, was a way of, I thought, creating an income which would make the house less susceptible to the vagaries of local authority funding and to sustain it into the future. But trying to achieve that without losing the other things was difficult. So the lawn in front, as you can see, very squalid. The side view in the 2008 before the project, with the coloured canopy cut off very much from the rose garden by a hedge. And then the red room, as then known, which was an aspect of the cafe, but with a door cut into the sideboard recess of the 18th century house. And the staircase, wonderful staircase, totally hidden away behind partitions, so that the only way to go at that stage was to go in at the lower ground level and go upstairs through the rest of the house. The room to the north on the upper ground floor had suffered a fire, and so here we can see the patching up of the ceiling and the wall, which was battened out with timber and plaster, which had been stripped off after the fire. And then on the south, the canopy supported by these rather crude circular section columns, and the inside of what had acted as an old people's sitting room, in effect, had been taken over by some artists with this rather extraordinary decoration. So faced with a house like this in the condition like this, obviously the first thing is to understand the history. And here is the 1870 Ordnance Survey map with the New River looping around in front of the house and the two lakes down here. A very, very beautiful estate with a set of stables and coach house here, which bankrupted the owner, unfortunately, and he only lived here for a short time. But by the 1890s, it was likely to be redeveloped, and it was acquired for a public park by the then vestry of Stoke Newington. So this is from the sale in 1805. Says, an elegant villa in complete order for a family of distinction, finished in a superior style. And then later on, delightful pleasure grounds ornamented with flourishing shrubs in full perfection, elegant lawn, vineyard, aviaries, hothouse, grapery, and capital kitchen garden. It was clearly a wonderful place and a very beautiful park. And that, I hope, has been recovered to a greater extent thanks to the project. project was actually about the house and the park, and we were architects for the house. And you can see here the slope leading up to the house, which is really a Grecian villa with Doric columns overlooking an idyllic landscape with the New River in the foreground. However, when you go to the rear of the house, it's a more conventional three-story Georgian villa with wings. And that sense of the two-story Grecian idyll on one side and the three-story more standard house as seen from the other is one of the most remarkable aspects of Clissold, and accounts for the fact that it has these glorious views in every single direction. So this is the master plan from the HLF project, which included extending the New River for an extra length, creating new aviaries and an improved deer park across the river here. And then here is a house with its slope restored and with a new terrace to the south looking over the pleasure garden, and then a very splendid new play area. We were fortunate to have a plan of the house from the early years of the last century, which had a before and after version. And so the before version here seems to record pretty closely what the house was intended to be when it was built. In the previous cafe, that partition had been taken out. One had been put in here and here. Then, in fact, it was supposed to be a door here into the hallway with the staircase, and then the dining room and drawing room. I think these would have been the other way round. This was the recess for the sideboard. Then the library at this end, and a dressing room and so on at the other end, which is the room which got burnt out. So here we have the way that it looked in 2008, and if you compare that with that, you can see how the cafe is there and the staircase is completely cut off, and the kitchen of the cafe was in the best one of the best rooms of the house. And this is as it is now, which is trying to get back the major qualities of the 18th century house, with the servery, cafe, function room, and then in the least significant part of the house, the loo and the lift. Here's the lower ground level. What we have done is to raise the level to get level access through for wheelchairs and disabled people, through to the lift lobby here, which takes you up through the house, then the house loos, as it were, and then at a lower level, because the house is built up on quite a big plinth, we removed the floor, which had already been partly removed, so that the park WCs, which are entered from here and here, are at the external ground level, and then these vaulted spaces underneath the front lawn. And then at the top, this is the 18th century house with its bedrooms, and then it had been converted into two flats. So here's the diagonal entrances, and then the two function rooms with big storage rooms and the kitchen servery. So the work started, major scaffold, because all of the roof needed to be redone. And then once we'd removed the partitions, then the view of the staircase and the room that's now the servery. And we have the rather wonderful house, in my view, in the idyllic landscape, where I hope that the balance between public and private income generation has been struck in an acceptable fashion, because there's a door into the cafe in the middle and there's a separate door into the staircase hall. It means that, in effect, functions can spill out onto the terrace in parallel with public use of the cafe. And I was worried about this, but it does seem to work. And the two coexist happily and contribute to the economic sustainability of it. There was also a campaign to stop the levelling of the lawn, but that failed. And I hope you agree that it looks so much more attractive. And indeed, sitting on the lawn looking over the river is a great pleasure. Just a detail about levels. We had to raise the pavement in order to get level access to the entrance here where the lift is and to the terrace on the south. And as a consequence, the plinth, which you see on the other side of the house where the loos are, which is very tall, was going to be submerged by the paving. And we had a big row with the English heritage person about this, who wanted to have a steep ramp with balustrades either side. But they finally agreed on the basis that we put a grille here so you can still see the whole height of the plinth. Then there's the cafe servery and the complication here of putting in dumbwaiters down to the kitchen and the lower level, which involves taking out the whole of a chimney breast. That was perhaps the key to getting it to work. And then the staircase inside, and you just around the corner, the extra door into the space from directly from outside. And here's a function going on. After the park is shut, then it can take over the whole house with its own security guards at the entrance. But really, it's about public benefit. And here, the sense of just lying in a beautiful park on the grass makes it, to my mind, one of the nicest parks in London. We move on to Newington Green Unitarian Chapel, which is, as you know, on the north end of Newington Green, and it looks rather like a Victorian chapel, which on the outside it is. But underneath, it's a nonconformist chapel, late 18th century. And amazingly, there's a photograph of it before it was rejigged in 1860 with its brick and its small pediment replaced by the big one that exists now. Inside, you get the 1860s seating and then the extra apse, which was added at that date. And the corners here, I think, were cut off later to give a view of the stage area, as it were, and then looking in the other direction with the central roof light. The original chapel, which was just the square here, with its added semicircle, was augmented further by a building at the back in the 19th century. This is the first floor with the stone staircase leading up to another room. And then on the upper floor, the gallery, which has got step seating here, and a tiny area of basement. So again, in terms of economic and social regeneration, then the needs were to allow full wheelchair access, which was quite a problem because there's a step here, a step here, a step here, a step here, and to create a whole new meeting room at basement level, which meant digging out the whole of that area. So these are the plans afterwards, with a ramp going up here, then the floor of the chapel ramped up, then a further ramp taking you up onto the stage with a door at immediate level, which is at the height such that you could get through on the level to here. So, and then there's the lift, which joins all three levels. Again, like so many of these jobs, a creative attempt to create the access which is needed to allow the place to realize its full potential as it goes on. and the access is absolutely fundamental, as is the circulation. The rather remarkable section with a new room dug out under the building at the back. And here the stage at the back of the chapel with a projection booth replacing the organ at the back. Some drawings just showing the effect of the new access, the new reception, the new meeting room at the first floor level, and the chapel. And then this remarkable photograph showing how perilously propped up the whole of the rear building was, with the spine wall propped up with the steel, the chimney breast propped up with the steel, and then excavating down to a full depth before putting in a concrete, basically U-liners to the basement. Heroic piece of engineering. Then the front before, with its mini railings, which were not historic, and we've put the new ramp leading in at the front. And the meeting room in the chapel in the middle. The chapel is fascinating because it's genuinely religion without religion, and the slogan is believe in good rather than believe in God. And it's a thoroughly admirable coming together of people from all sorts of descriptions. The minister is Jewish, and it was an extraordinary job to have been involved with, and full marks to them for getting it right. So here is a new welcoming entrance and the stairs up from the basement. The rather fascinating iron gate which cut off the access to the gallery, and then up on the gallery the fixed seating which we retained. One of the pleasures of one's working with old building is making discoveries, and this was one of the most extraordinary discoveries, which was in a safe in the meeting room. There was this chalice which was designed and made by C.R. Ashby, the famous arts and crafts hero, and it makes a very nice link to the next project, which is Toynbee Hall, which is on Commercial Street just north of Whitechapel Road. And Toynbee Hall was one of the main, if not possibly the first, university settlement set up by Canon Barnet, married to Henrietta Barnet, who chose to be vicar in a church in Whitechapel in the 1880s in order to bring education and good works, if you like, to what was then one of the poorest parts of the metropolis, with a large immigrant population. And here you see Canon Barnet with his volunteers, who were all Oxbridge graduates, who volunteered for a period of, I think, 2 or 3 years, to go and live in the East End and do works of education. And it was a most remarkable institution, and boasted are some very remarkable people over its history. C.R. Ashby was one of those, and it was while he was at Toynbee Hall that he set up the Guild of Handicraft, which was moved to the first East London, further east, and then to the Cotswolds. And that became one of the the first arts and crafts schools in the Cotswolds. And I'll come back to him in relation to the work that he did at Toynbee Hall. But others later on included Attlee, Clement Attlee, Beveridge, who I think was writing the Beveridge Report that led to the welfare state after the Second World War, partly while he was at Toynbee Hall. And then later on, Profumo, who volunteered after his disgrace in the Profumo scandal, and spent his latter years there, and indeed one of the buildings is named after him. Now, this is Whitechapel in the 1880s, and this in the middle of it is Toynbee Hall. And you can see that it's totally surrounded by other buildings, totally invisible. And there was a gatehouse here, like an Oxbridge gatehouse, which led into the courtyard. We're talking here this is the OS plan in 1894, but the Toynbee Hall was set up in 1884, and 1888 was when the Whitechapel was notorious for the Jack the Ripper murders, which were taking place, quite close to. The building, designed by someone called Elijah Hoole in early 1880s, looked like this, and you can see it has two wide gables and a single gable with mullioned and transomed windows, slightly like a Tudor manor house, with chimneys which are ribbed and fluted in the manner of Norman Shaw and the Queen Anne and the early English revival. That link with Norman Shaw and radical architecture in the 1880s is continued in the most remarkable way inside. This is the dining hall where the volunteers had their meals. And what do we see? We see William Morris rush seating, probably ebonized, sideboards and framed pictures, ceramic overmantel. And even more so when we go to the drawing room, here we have more Godwin-style aesthetic movement tables, great big canopies here. We have aesthetic-looking tables and chairs around here. And when you look at the photograph which survives, what do we see? Well, these appear to be Japanese vertical hangings or aesthetic ones stimulated by Japanese scroll-like proportions. And here we have a wonderful ebonized sideboard with presumably blue and white china on the side. And here we have the postgraduates with their elegant girlfriends in the drawing room. And again, these very vertical, rather Japanese prints. And then the staircase is quite remarkable because it's actually fretted from timber about 3 inches thick. As we see it here, it sort of scrolls of foliage with various bits which have been broken off because you can see the grain of the timber. This is a single panel of timber, has split on the along the grain. I'm very interested by the links between this fretting and the fretting that you get on a famous chair by McMurdo, which follows on from the frontispiece that he did to Rennes city churches, which Pevsner calls one of the first examples of Art Nouveau, which moves to the continent and maybe not taken up here so much, but I come to the conclusion that Hoole was very much more up to the moment than you might think. And then there's the lecture hall, which is where the education and the whole took place, open to the local working men. I can't see many women there. And this is the way it looked before we started the project. And then the next room is the dining room. Here it is in its rather more aesthetic guise with fans and porcelain. And these are the crests of the Oxbridge colleges who supplied the graduates who volunteered at Toynbee Hall. And if you can see the rail, which is along the top of the wall, and the what are sort of flower motifs stenciled onto the wall, and then compare it with here. This is following C.R. Ashby's redecoration, and he used the Japanese-like circular, they're called pies in Japan. These symbolize the tree of life for Ashby. And you get the tree with its roots, possibly representing water as well. And then the branches of the tree are intertwined, rather like the Ankh symbol in Egypt, which is the symbol of eternity and longevity. And so here's a great man who not only set up Gilded Handicraft, he also set up the Survey of London, and he designed those lovely houses on Chelsea Embankment on Cheyne Walk. And this is an attempt to regain his intended colour scheme. We're not quite sure whether it's like this. And this is before we started, and you can see how these rather extraordinary slender cast iron columns, which are supporting the beam of the roof, have been cut across by this terrible moulding here, which is actually about hiding a strip light. And one of the things I was determined to do was to get rid of that, and we succeeded. Then in 1930, the lecture room had some paintings around the frieze of the room made by Archibald Ziegler. And those paintings have been thought to be lost, only recovered from photographs. But during the course of the work, we found that the frieze from here to here had been covered with boards. And when we turned the boards round, we discovered the paintings painted on the back of them. So that's a future project for restoring and reinstating those. As I say, Toynbee Hall was hidden away from the street, but the street frontage, which included the building where Ashby started up the Gilded Handicraft, was badly bombed and turned into a rather ineffectual sunken garden. And here is the gate lodge, the Oxbridge-like gate lodge, leading through from the commercial street. Here we have the plan in 1885, and you can see how the lecture room, which is the social purpose, was the room here. And then everything else is for the volunteers. So they have their drawing room here. The way in is here, cloakroom and loos, going past 3 sitting rooms. To the corridor and then into the dining hall, and then there's a servants' hall and the servants' wing. Our first involvement was in 2012. By this stage, Toynbee Hall had acquired many of the buildings around the site for residential use. They decided to pass the residential on to more specialist providers and to concentrate on the service that they provided within Toynbee Hall itself. This is the lecture room and the dining room, and by that stage, here's a corridor which runs inside the wall, and here is a sort of umbilical of buildings which have been built around the outside. And the master plan was to do what was called a land swap, which was to take the land which belonged to Toynbee Hall in front of it and to swap it for this bit of land, so that they could put up a building here which paid for restoring the hall itself. And then this is Profumo House. So that failed because, if you recall, the mayor of Tower Hamlets was accused of corruption, and therefore any transaction in which council land was being traded for private land was seen as being entirely suspect. So that fell through. And other developers and architects have now redeveloped, in fact, the whole of the residential around the perimeter of the site. And we carried on adapting Toynbee Hall itself for a brighter, more sustainable future. The first important issue was that the entrance, which had previously been here, was totally invisible from the high street. So we took out the 3 rooms here with major structural intervention in order to create an entrance hall here for a new spine, which ran up not inside the building as it was before, but outside, so that you were seeing the revealed outside wall of Toynbee Hall. And then on the first floor, this is where there was a whole set of small bedrooms for the volunteers, with a common room in the middle and then a corridor around the outside and separate little cubicle rooms. And we kept the meeting room in the middle and cleared out as many of the partitions in the middle to create the offices. And then here there was a flat for people who would volunteer and live on site. And up the staircase here, another 2 residential flats for volunteers in the roof. And then along the corridor here, which is actually at a lower level than this room, 2 extra meeting rooms here. So this is the way it all looked at the back in 2012. And the kitchen with its extract pipe, the single story of development around the outside. And this is what we proposed, which was in alliteration with the gables of Toynbee Hall itself, that we would have 5 small gables, which I'm very pleased with, although you can't see them very much. And it relates to arts and crafts precedents, like particularly Philip Webb at Standon. And then at the front, then the restored elevation with a new wing, which has got the striated ribbed brick stimulated by the aesthetic movement and Norman Shaw in the Queen Anne and Old English. So here's the photograph at the rear with the gables and the 2 planes of brickwork and the new housing around the edge. And the main entrance, which is formed by dropping the and widening the window, which was here previously, and that is now nice and visible. This is the way into the lecture room, which would have been used by the local youths. The entrance hall with the line of the previous rooms, and then the corridor, which runs along the outside of the rear wall of the building, where we wanted to have a glass slot so that you could see up the whole height of the rear wall. This is looking back from the other end. And then this is up at first floor level with the opening through to the first floor corridor with the top of the glass, and the glass coming in from top light above. The only problem was that there were complaints right as we'd reached practical completion about upskirting, and so we had to put on a film in order to prevent that. And just one of those little details here, there's in fact a gentle ramp from here to here, and this opening here starts at the bottom of the ramp, so that at this point it's level, and the threshold at this point is sloping. So in fact, sloping level, it's a hyperbolic paraboloid. And I remember arguing at length on several occasions to say that that was possible before they would actually go ahead and do it. And here's the lecture room with its nice new oak floor. and the Ashby decorated dining room. And here's the portrait of Joseph and Henrietta Barnett, who founded the thing, and the crests now with a right amount of space around them, and the columns without the batten running across them. And first floor, this was a most amazingly complicated project because the big rooms, lecture room and dining room, the ground floor, had got all these small bedrooms on the floor above with this meeting room in the middle of the plan. And as you can see, this is after a lot of the partitions have been removed, but the floor was put in first, and then they built the partitions. And structurally speaking, therefore, it was a nightmare to work out how much of this we could take away to open it up. And here's the room in the middle with its nice boarding. And then just a final detail from the aesthetic movement, the balustrade after repair with all of its tendrils replaced, and the rather lovely William de Morgan style tiles added above a more Gothic chimney piece in the first floor with the asymmetric shelves, which again, testament to the sort of Japanese influence coming in at the time. In finishing, I'd just like to come back to the question of what we might call what we do, what I do. I think my motivation when I first started working as an architect with old buildings was actually about restoration, in other words, recovering something which had been lost through dereliction or so on. But it's moved several paces away from that because I now feel that restoration is too often akin to nostalgia and the feeling that something in the past was better, which I don't believe. What I do believe is that historic buildings can serve people today and tomorrow and improve their quality of life. So I then move to thinking that the pleasure of and reward of working with old buildings was about giving them a new use which was beneficial for people. When I started writing my book, it began under the title New Uses for Old Buildings. But then I realized that really what I thought I was doing was architecture for which happened to be to do with existing buildings rather than with new buildings. And the title of my book became Old Buildings, New Architecture. And so when we think back to all of those words previously, refurbishment, repair, whatever, the latest one from the Architect's Journal, which is retrofit, which is particularly horrid, then I feel even more strongly that working with old buildings is a matter of architecture, first and foremost, because architecture embraces all of those things which are important to providing the quality of life that I was talking about. That you can't find a definition better than that given by Vitruvius, the Roman architect, which was that architecture depended on firmitas, commoditas, and venustas. Firmitas, construction or structure; commoditas, commodity or utility or function; and venustas, after Venus, beauty. Also translated as commodity, firmness, and delight by Wotton. So I do feel that it's a third of those beauty which is not talked about very much. it's somehow embarrassing that beauty is, in any case, in the eye of the beholder. And so, and any architect who talks about it is shot down by the person who doesn't happen to find their work beautiful. Nevertheless, in my own case, I feel that every decision I make is driven at one level by beauty, whether it's how you repair a building and deal with the colour of the matching mortar, whether you clean a building. And this was particularly intense, of course, in the context of the two cathedrals I looked after, Southwark Cathedral and St Albans, one for 16 and one for 18 years, where that sense of providing a legacy which would be there after you were dead and was one which needed to stand the test of time was most evident. Anyway, as far as this talk is concerned, then I hope that the examples I've shown in Hackney go some way to illustrate an approach which is, I hope, useful as well as useful and technically sound. Thank you.
Hi, Richard. That was great. Really good to hear about the detail of 3 projects that are in Hackney. Now, you've been working on many, many projects, but tonight we're actually talking, with the Hackney Society about your Hackney projects. And I live in Hackney, so I know them all quite well. But on the Clissold house project, for example, it was in need of repair, and I think that the photographs there that you showed us, particularly the ones after the fire, showed that it was in really bad disrepair at that stage. At what stage did you actually take up your project?
We, in fact, although I'd lived in Newington since 1986 and visited the house probably just about most weekends, I only joined the project when they had to re-tender because it was an HLF funded project. And the team who had got through to the shortlisting stage decided that they hadn't really got the proper historic building person to deal with the house, because the project previously had been much more park-led and the house had been kind of forgotten about, which is very much what happens in public parks up and down London. So it's great that within the project, the house was actually dealt with as a separate project in terms of construction. So that meant it was easier to give it the focus which it might otherwise have lacked. So anyway, that's the background.
And did it take you long to do the overall project, from start to finish?
I think probably 2.5 years. Most of the projects like that would be another year or two longer, because we like to feel that we're involved right the way through, including the HLF stage 1. In this case, it was John Bolter who had taken it that far, and obviously for him it must have been extraordinarily painful to lose the project at that stage, but nevertheless that's what happens. And so yeah, I mean,
yeah, very interesting, because one of the major changes from the outside is, you used to have kind of the raised platform where people would have tea and coffee at tables and chairs, and then you went back to the original Greek classical style of the sloped garden to the front.
Yeah.
Now there's kind of rose gardens around the back, and you showed us some photographs of that. How far were you able to take the actual the rose garden? Did you leave them the way they were, or do you allow for more people to actually use that space?
Well, what you need to remember is that part of the case for removing the flat area of grass in front of the house and putting it back to a slope It was the fact that that involved loss of seating, which was the reason for the petition to say that shouldn't happen. So I had always been very clear that the compensation for being able to put it back as a slope was that you had another area of a cafe at the lower level opening to the south, getting rid of the hedge which previously cut it off, and then have what was at that stage called a pleasure ground instead of the rose garden. The rose garden was very much, I think, a product of some time after the house became a public park in the 1890s. And my recollection is that it was just about wide enough between them to lie out, but it wasn't particularly friendly. So the idea was it was more like an 18th century pleasure ground with dog-free and with a higher quality of planting around the house in that area of lawn. And I have to say it's one of my disappointments that I don't think the landscape in that area has been treated very well, and the fact that it's great to see children playing, but they can kick their ball around and they just trample over those plants. That's not quite how we envisaged it.
It was very interesting when you showed us the article from the Times for a for sale article on the Clissold house, and it mentioned things like the a hothouse and grapery. Is a hothouse, was there actually a glass house on the grounds at one stage?
Yes, the chap who built it was a member of the banking family. Not Coots. What's the other one on the Strand called? Come back to me. But he was a younger brother, and so he hadn't inherited the full amount of money, and he basically bankrupted himself in doing a house which was much more grand than he could ever afford, and he had to move out relatively soon, which is sad. But yes, it had all of the pertinences of a country house, although in this case it was right on top of the village of Stoke Newington. No, amazing. The story is interesting as well. It goes back a long way in history. And the interesting thing is that of the three projects that you actually have, the other two projects, the Unitarian Chapel and Toynbee Hall, are actually much more socialist at their heart and their ethos. And that's what I love about those two projects, how the whole movement and how the whole arts and crafts connection is there. And I loved when you actually said that in Unitarian Chapel, you discovered the chalice by Christopher Ashby, and I just thought that was incredible. So was there anything else that you discovered? Like that was hidden in a safe or something? But I mean, what else was there? There must have been. Well, I have to say that one of the pleasures of working with old buildings is getting to see the bits that other people don't get to see, and it's normally the attics and the cellars which are the most strongly evocative buildings. And I went just last week down the crypt of one of the Hawksmoor churches, still half full of bodies, and it's quite fantastic. And so there is a sense that the sheer aspect of age, both in terms of the way materials have weathered and in terms of the textures that you get of decay, is something which in itself I think be extremely beautiful. And so I'm hoping that although in Clissold, I think the best will in the world, the textures which came from dereliction were not particularly pleasant ones, and therefore it made sense to do a more of a restoration job. There are places in the Unitarian Chapel, for example, the gallery, to be able to consciously not touch the seats which were up there, and the railings in front of the entrance, And occasionally you have to argue quite strongly that they may not have any functional purpose any longer, but they are part of what makes a building special, and they are beautiful in their own way. And so there's quite a lot of that. There was famously, of course, at Sutton House, there was the cobwebs in the closet on the first floor, which I carefully preserved.
I was going to say listed cobwebs.
Listed cobwebs.
Yeah. But do you ever find that, in dealing with, restoring listed buildings, that the actual officers that are there, do you find that they're too prescriptive sometimes? I mean, that must be a challenge, and we have challenges with that. But do you have challenges? And tell us some of them and how you might have got over them.
Well, I have been working in the field long enough to feel that I have more experience and know much more than any local authority conservation officer, and indeed most people in English heritage. Now, I mean, I hope that doesn't sound arrogant, but I mean,
you're an advisor.
It's just a fact, and therefore, what I know is that I'm unlikely to put forward something which isn't arguable within the legislation, which doesn't mean that you don't hit a block occasionally. And so all I can say is that you have to do your homework. You have to, particularly in the case of cathedrals, you have to sort of say that you've looked at 6 different options to prove why the one you want is the only one that's really going to work, and give all of the background from the analysis of what makes a building special and so on. So you hope the case seems inexorable. It doesn't always work out that way, but and what I never do is go to anyone and say, what will you let us do? I have to say, this is what we want to do. This is why we think you ought to allow it. And if they don't, then I argue back fiercely. And I think not many people are prepared to do that. And then some of the consultancy work I do with bigger practices, bigger projects, then they're terrified of saying boo to the goose.
Yes, I know. But what when a conservation officer says, well, they didn't have damp-proof coursing in Victorian times, therefore you're not allowed to do it now, even though it's hidden in outer space. What do you say to them?
Well, I suppose I have the advantage that many of the buildings I'm dealing with are sort of more highly listed, and therefore they're dealt with by people who are the more likely to know what you're what they're dealing with. If you get a junior person and it's a domestic extension, then that's hell, because you can't reach someone higher up the tree in order to say, look, this is entirely unreasonable.
Yeah, that's good. Now you mentioned the word dereliction. You mentioned that a lot. Is your work a loss as well as a gain? Now, dereliction can be the beauty of the old Gothic ruin. Tell us in your ethos and your approach to your work, the loss and the gain.
Well, I think I said at one point that maybe before I became an architect, but became interested in old buildings, it's the idea that you could regain their splendor, and the beauty lay in what they were intended to be and had been once. And it was probably particularly my involvement with Sutton House which made me fall in love with the bits which were either derelict or you got a texture which you would lose if you painted, or you had the squatters graffiti, and you could say, well, actually I can find aesthetic satisfaction in the squatters graffiti much more than plastering the room and making it look like what it might have done before. And so I suppose I've been much more Catholic over the years in looking for beauty wherever you can find it. But it doesn't mean that it isn't looking for beauty. And so that's why I would say it would be wrong to preserve in its in its eroded state. You know, some of the rooms at Clissold, for example.
Yeah.
But it's become very fashionable these days, of course, to do what is commonly called preserve as found, and you could say the Noyes Museum by my former boss, Julian Harrop, David Chipfield, exemplifies that. But actually, and it was Julian who I, learned such a lot from basically about aesthetics and architecture with a capital A, because the extraordinary thing about the Noyes Museum is it's so fantastically well built.
Oh, it's beautiful.
All the materials are so beautiful that you want to leave that on show, but for me, it doesn't work, for example, at the Trocadero in Paris, where Locaton and Vassal just so you'd have the strip out contract and you're waiting to do the fit out contract, but it never gets done. Do you follow me?
Yeah, I do indeed.
If it's Howard Tompkins at the Battersea Art Centre or at one or two other theatres they've done, then it seems to me that they've got the eye about aesthetics, I suppose, is a way to
But talking about aesthetics, when you were working on Toynbee Hall, for example, apart from the great ethos as being the first university, and the William Morris seating, you had the sideboards, you had. What I loved in particular was that fretwork, the timber fretwork on the actual staircase. I mean, that must be almost unique. And for you to go in there and to restore all the little finials and bits like that. I mean, how did you find the actual craftspeople to know how to do it without destroying it?
Well, the craftspeople are there. And on the whole, with some exceptions, we don't tend to say you should use this particular craftsman unless it's craft which is elevated to the level of art. In other words, if you're carving a new gargoyle for the cathedral, then you might want a particular person. So in case of that fretwork, we just say, this is a big drawing showing all the bits which are missing, and then just do it. And it's up to the contractor to find the right carpenter. But in a funny way, carpenters are quite often doing rather mundane things a lot of the time, and they really rise to a challenge of doing something like that. And there's a big art in breeding, if you like, a sense of satisfaction in the craft people in a firm who are not necessarily specialists in working with old buildings, in order to do that. And I mean, the most extraordinary example in my career was on Romford Road. There's a timber frame building, 5 bays wide with clabberding on the outside, and it was refurbished by basically a mass housing contractor, because they were the only people on the approved list of the council who could do it. And it was a battle, absolute battle, to get these guys to do what I wanted. And they're looking up to heaven and looking either side of you. But suddenly there came the point at which they realized that actually they were achieving something rather special. And from then it became absolutely downhill, and that was so rewarding. I mean, it did take rather more than half the length of the job to get to that point. That's another point.
But I think it's all about, as you say, it's about improving the quality of people's lives. And I always see that as it's like pages of history. When you look back in time in architecture and urban place, if you rip out any pages, you are missing the story. And I think that's what's so important about the work that you do. So, and it's absolutely beautiful. And we're only looking at small things in Hackney here, important jobs, but you've worked on so many fine cathedrals and churches, and really at the heart of the real restoration.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, you've just frozen. But if I could just comment on that the the word that I didn't use in the talk, which I probably should have done, is layering.
Now we've got a lot of questions that have
Sorry.
whoops.
Okay, sorry, we lost you for a bit. So
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
Shall I just finish saying what I was saying? It was about layering.
Yes.
The idea that historic buildings are always more complicated than you think. They always have extra layers of alteration during their life, which usually adds to the interest. I suppose the one example at Clissold where you could say you could have made a different decision would be those paintings in the old people's room at ground level, which were rather fun, but whether they would have been compatible with the use, I don't know. But anyway, the idea of layering, and in the cathedrals, of course, you know, it's enormous numbers of layers of history and alteration, and that makes them so rich, just in the same way that
Yes.
layers of meaning in a Shakespeare play or whatever.
Well, that's actually one of the questions here we've got from Robert, and he says, "Hi, Richard. Thanks for the talk. In your opinion, are the palimpsest layers of multiple histories and changes of use over time of a building are worth highlighting than one specific historic iteration?" I think that's what you're really saying, that the palimpsest layers that tell a story, but you don't wipe them out.
Yes, I mean, obviously, I mean, if we take the buildings I'm talking about today, then Toynbee Hall was not actually terribly heavily altered, but except for the new additions around the outside. But the attics and the first floor, it was though they hadn't changed since the early years of the last century, and they were fantastically derelict. I mean, you know, almost, you know, rotten and collapsing, and so that, if you like, is a sort of one-layer building, so it makes it clearer how to do it, except that of course it's two-layer because our new additions are a major thing, but they're next door to it. And in that project, and maybe I didn't make this clear enough, but the exposed rear wall of the original building was very, very important to me, because we had demolished everything that was built up against it, and we had done the best to, you know, do bits of patching and pointing and things to make it compose. But at the end of the day, I think it's what makes it, because previously you just got lost. You'd no idea where you were in the building, but now everyone knows immediately, you know, where they are by relationship to the brick wall. So I hope that thing of new and old there sort of works. I think
it works particularly well there, particularly well in the proper spab way.
Yeah. And then in Newington Green, it's really now a three-layer building. The you know, the original Georgian preaching box, and then the 1860s major alterations, the building at the back, and the our layer on top. And layer, I think, is quite a good way of working at it. So I suppose rather than palimpsest, I prefer the word layering, because it can be, whereas a palimpsest, I believe, you tend to be rubbing out what was there before and then writing something new.
Yeah, indeed.
It's only the parchment which remains the same. And
exactly.
three-dimensional jigsaw between the new and the old and the different layers.
I've got a question here from Nick, and this is talking about the chapel. An elegant solution at the chapel for level access. So many schemes seem to make a mess of it, especially in a heritage context. What are the secrets to designing sensitive ramps? And you're also an access expert, so you are well used to dealing with historic buildings and access.
Well, I think the first thing is to feel that it's not a social problem. Well, it is a social problem, but having, I have to say, when I started my career, I was antediluvian in my views. I thought that it was wrong that as I would have put it then, a small number of people could impose unacceptable alterations on a historic building just in order to get access for those few. Well, what changed was, if you like, first one attitude is saying no, this is fundamental, and having experienced a bit of time in a wheelchair myself, that changes your mind quite significantly. And then the question becomes, well, okay, if we've got to do it, how do you do it beautifully? And it is, I think, the biggest design challenge that we have in every single project is how to do it beautifully.
Absolutely.
And, I think that it's quite ingenious at the Newington Green Chapel, not least because the ramps are taken out over such a long length, you don't really notice them. And the intermediate level that we've chosen corresponds with the box seating just in front of the stage, so you can get a wheelchair into those side boxes, and then you can get the wheelchair up to the ramp onto the stage. And it so happens that the intermediate level is right then for getting over the step that you get to go into the rear building. However, the consequence of that is that the doors, which lead from the stage into the other, either had to be lifted by 6 inches, or we had to chop 6 inches off the bottom of the door. And
a challenge.
We did a bit of sort of jiggery pokery about how much off the door and how much on the steepness of the ramp. And I think at the end of the day, nobody would notice the doors have been chopped. And so, it was like an acceptable balance. But the most extreme case was St. Alphege in Greenwich, the great Hawksmoor church, where the main body of the church is about 8 steps above outside churchyard. And so I've been architect of that church for 25 years, and it took us 25 years to find the solution that was acceptable to everyone. And funnily enough, it was actually quite close to the very first sketch that I did at Interview 25.
That's good.
A very, very, very long ramp. And by doing it in bronze and timber, it weathered against the Portland stone. And then the crucial thing was to avoid the problem that you always get about the landing, that you have to have halfway along with a ramp that long, and wanting to avoid something which the handrail goes up, then it's level, and then it goes up. And that was the it's not really for now, but Norman Foster nearly wrecked the British Museum project by insisting that there wasn't going to be a landing halfway up the staircase that wrapped around the reading room. But anyway, that's another story.
I think every architect needs to spend some time in a wheelchair, and politicians too, just to get that feel, and as a cyclist, but we won't go there. I'm going to give you the next question.
Just to finish in St. Alphege, then, so what actually happens is the floor of the ramp goes on a level ramp, but the handrail is a single line the whole way through. And to get the builder to do that was
very hard to do.
They nearly messed it up, but we salvaged it for the last one.
No, but it's just a very cool looking entrance. You hardly even notice the ramp, and I think that it has been very well done. Okay, I've got a question here from Fen one and. When you approach a project, do you approach the sites in the same manner, same ethos, same process, or do you treat each building differently?
I think the process is similar, but the product is inevitably very, very different. So the process is actually slightly the methodology that you now use for what's called a conservation management plan, and the stages of that are: number one, doing the history to understand how the building comes to be as it is now. Second stage is working out what's significant about the building, and that may be social or architectural or to do with rare orchids or whatever. And then the third stage is looking at the issues which are facing it, and then out of that you hope that you can get a direction. In the CMP it's called policies, and the idea is that you write that before you do the work and brief the architect accordingly. I, as you can imagine, refuse to submit to that discipline, and therefore I'm making my own conclusions about what the policies might be. But the first three stages you have to do, because otherwise you can get badly tripped up. And again, occasionally it can show great opportunities. So at the In and Out Club, Robert Thorne found that wartime damage had blown up one section of the front, which allowed us to make the case for doing something which we wouldn't otherwise been able to do.
No, that's really good. Following on from that question, actually, Ray Blackburn asks, how far did the clients push back when you made decisions about what to conserve or disguise or replace? So how far did the clients push back?
Well, obviously it varies very much from project to project. The interesting thing about working with cathedrals is they have a fabric advisory committee who are a group of experts who are advising on it, and that's very helpful because it distances you directly from the dean, who may or may not be sympathetic to what you're saying might be done. The problem normally comes when there are issues about cost, needless to say, and one of the reasons I particularly called attention to the batten in the Ashby Hall at Toynbee Hall going across the front of it was because at a late stage in the job, despite the fact that whenever I went along and say, why haven't you taken off the batten yet? The client, or rather the client's representative, said, oh no, we can't possibly do that now, they've forgot all about it, and it's too late, they've already painted this, they've got to come in tomorrow. And I had to stage a major sort of hissy fit in order to allow that happen. So occasionally, you have to be able to have a big row. But on the whole, I think we've been fortunate in having a lot of clients who very much appreciate their building and what you're trying to do for it.
I've got two more here. Andrew Pink asks, I wonder what happened to the organ in NG Chapel. Was a photographic survey made of it prior to it going?
It's a good question. Yes, there are photographs of it. In terms of a photographic survey in an archival sense, I'm not quite sure that was done, and I believe that the organ found a home somewhere, but I would have to refer back to Seville, my job architect, to remind me, I'm afraid. So organs are always an issue, and in the case of that one, then my starting point had been because they wanted to have the extra space on the gallery, and they'd sacrificed, according to my insistence, not sacrificed, they'd retained the seating at the other end. I was suggesting that maybe we could keep the organ front and just do it as a decorative thing against the back.
They're so beautiful. I mean, the whole structures are so amazing.
But I was basically told that wasn't what they want to do, and so there's a limit of how far you can push things.
Sure.
I mean, it's interesting that in my consultancy, I have to be very, very aware the whole time that it's not me who's the client. So I can only really say, I don't recommend that. I don't think you should do that. But only have any power behind what I'm saying is if I say, well, I don't think you should be doing that. But more particularly, I don't think that the local authority is going to let you. And
Yeah.
unless I can say, well, in case of the organ, there's no pressure to keep it from the statutory side, and so I was without any teeth, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. But they do add such value to a space and the history, and they're just beautiful objects in themselves. And yeah, amazing. Now we've only got a few minutes left, Richard. So I want to talk about your new book, Old Buildings, New Architecture. And Nick was going to put up the little sign there because there's a special discount code, guys. You can buy it for 20 quid tonight if you're listening online. But the book describes the challenges in creating architecture by adding a new layer to old buildings. Okay, so tell us, one or two of those challenges that you actually share in your book will be ones that a lot of architects that do conservation and restoration have. What do you think are maybe the unusual challenges that you've come across that you can share with us?
Well, I think one of the most extraordinary was actually the In and Out Club on Piccadilly, because I think we were recommended by Alan Baxter's, who'd written a historical report about the building. And I remember going on a miserable winter day to meet the client, who was a sort of major, well, he called himself a property developer. He wasn't actually a property developer. He got permissions for buildings and then sold them on, or that was the idea. And I met the chap who was running this project on the roof of the rear building in the In and Out Club, on top of the ballroom. And he said, "Can you get me another 8 stories of accommodation?" And I said no, and I thought, well, I'll never hear from him again. But we got called back, and in an amazing way, it was the most exciting project I've done, because we found that by keeping the major ground floor circulation to link what was in effect 5 existing listed buildings, we could make what he wanted, which was a 106-bed hotel.
Yeah.
Making all of the existing buildings and all of the existing staircase work. And the previous architect had spent a year getting nowhere with English heritage in trying to knock down one of the buildings and put in a new major staircase in the middle of the site. And it was the rudest letter from English heritage that I've ever read, saying something like, "Carry on with this architect, you'll never get anywhere."
Well, these things happen.
So, but one of the reasons it was such fun is that, having sort of sorted out all of the circulation in the bedrooms, then there was a thing about the spa. And of course, being a beautiful Palladian villa originally in the middle of the In and Out Club, it's got this lovely brick vaulted cellars. And so all of those were going to become, spa rooms. And then there was going to be a great swimming pool underneath the whole of the forecourt. And it was in my mind that that ought to be Byzantine, because in flavor, because the history of bathing obviously moves from ancient Rome via Constantinople to the Turks in Istanbul, and then to Austria-Hungary, and then back to here. So anyway, that was fun. That was fun.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I suppose that the gallery, well, not the gallery, I suppose that the basement area of the brick vaults was probably the wine cellar, wasn't it? For such a grand villa.
Some of it would have been wine cellars. It was probably also coal and general sort of storage. But I think the reason for the brick vaulted cellar was very much about emulating ancient Rome itself, which is
Yes.
what, you know, the flavor of the building was moving in that direction.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I've got one question here, but you may well have partly answered it from Sarah Pica. What do you think of renovations that keep layers of the building story, like Wilton's Music Hall? Are they better than a complete refurbishment? That's kind of harping back a little bit, jumping back a little bit. Do you cover those kind of things in your book as well?
I cover quite a lot of things about, if you like, preservers found. And I suppose when I said that you get the 3 stages of looking at the history and then looking at the significance or what makes buildings special, and then you look at the issues, it comes up with a different answer in every job. So Wilson's, for example, was derelict, and in the time that it was derelict, someone had the bright idea of saying it got dry rot and taking off every scrap of plaster in the whole building. So it had a very gutsy feeling as a consequence of that, which it would never have had originally. And I think Tim Ronalds has, done a great job of keeping that earthiness, in the same way that I think Howard Tompkins has done a great job at the theatre at Ali Pali or the Royal Court, of keeping that, the scars of age, if you like to put it that. But it's not a universal panacea.
Well, I think that's the beauty of somebody who has got, a passion for the building itself and the history of it, without wiping it all out or overdoing it, because so many people just overdo restoration these days, and you can't see the history, you can't see anything. But at the same time, you want to bring your building into a usable state as well, so that communities or whoever it is can actually use the building in a meaningful way and not be held back by too many rules and regs over the restoration.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I've been very lucky, really, to have had my centre of gravity in East London, where there've been so many buildings in a worse state of repair, and which haven't been messed up by other people in recent years in doing them up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Victorians were notorious for doing that too on Georgian buildings, weren't they?
Yeah. So I've got one at the moment. I mean, every time I think, we're running out of derelict buildings in East London, but you can usually find a few more. And, at the moment, we're working at the Ragged School Museum, and there you get this wonderful texture of flaking paints and things. And we're talking about quite how far we can go in preserving decay in that case.
Well, Richard, I could talk to you all evening, but our time is up. So I just want to say a big thank you to you, Richard Griffiths, and to Nick Perry of the Hackney Society for organising tonight's talk. And it will be available to viewers on the follow-up is going to be there on YouTube, and that will be out on all of the social media for the Hackney Society. So thank you to the audience for listening, and thank you for all your questions. Have a very enjoyable evening, and remember to buy that book. Good night.
Thank you, Angela.